I'm Josh Schneiderweiler, coming up on Football Today.
Here's Werner. And there's Forsberg! And they've done it! 2 goals from the Swede! And Julian Nagelsmann and Leipzig will qualify for the last 16 tonight.
When Ralf Rangnick took over as sporting director and manager of RB Leipzig in 2012, the club were in the 4th division of German football. Now, the club are transformed. They have qualified for the last 16 of the Champions League and are pushing Bayern Munich for the title. However, just last week, German newspaper Bild reported that Rangnick, who is the head of international relations and scouting at Red Bull, was set to join AC Milan as a manager and sporting director. Yesterday, La Gazzetta dello Sport in Italy contradicted Bild's report and said Milan wouldn't be hiring him based on his inexperience in Serie A. So today we ask, what is next for Ralf Rangnick, and can he replicate his success elsewhere?
Well, I would say he's one of the leading lights of his generation as far as coaching is concerned.
Raphael Honigstein covers German football for The Athletic.
The guy who, through his impact beyond the actual teams that he managed, has really changed German football. Because of his work with Hoffenheim and then later Red Bull, there's a whole network of coaches that have been inspired by him, by his ideas, and they have, to a large extent, maybe not taken over the Bundesliga, but certainly made a real difference. He's a guy who is tremendously clever, has an unbelievable sense for the game, for players as well. The only thing that he's missing is a bit of recognition because he hasn't been in a position to win the Bundesliga with any of his teams, nor any European football. And I think that's why perhaps his real value or his real position in the pantheon of German football is not universally understood as well as it should have been.
So what is his philosophy or approach to running a club?
So technically his philosophy is all about pressing. It doesn't sound very interesting or novel now, but it certainly was when he came through as a manager. He was one of the first managers in German professional football to play without a sweeper. Again, it sounds very mundane, but at the time, in the late 90s, it was revolutionary, it was very innovative. And of course, it is the foundation, the basis for a pressing game. It's only when you can press the space, you're then in a position to then press the ball. One follows from the other. His progress had been slow to begin with because he never really found the right club where they were open enough for his ideas to let him fully take control. I think he was also up against the German system, which also always sees a separation of powers. You know, there's always a strong sporting director. There's often a strong chairman or president who has his own views. And he often rubbed against these forces with his ideas and with his force of personality. And the real breakthrough, I guess, happened when he was given the job to take over Hoffenheim, who were, this team that effectively came into being when a wealthy benefactor, a software billionaire, took an interest and decided he wanted to establish them as a professional team. And there were a few false starts, but once Rangnick took control, they went to the Bundesliga and very nearly won the championship in their first ever season. And that's, I think, when people really became aware and understood just how good a manager he was. He then went to Schalke, which didn't quite work out. He then had to take a break from football because of mental health issues. And then he came back very, very strongly as a sports director for Leipzig, setting up the whole Leipzig and RB Red Bull group of football teams, as well as fostering a wave of very talented managers, the likes of Hasenhüttl, Roger Schmidt, ultimately Nagelsmann as well, Marco Rose. They all have gone through the RB Leipzig school, which to a large extent is the Ralf Rangnick school.
What were those mental health issues that you just alluded to?
He suffered from a burnout syndrome at Schalke. He basically just did too much. He was trying to do everything. He was trying to run the whole club. He was interested in minute details, organizing the bus trips, taking interest in the hotel, making sure the players ate the right things. And there were people at Schalke who were doing all these things, but I guess he ultimately didn't quite trust them enough, and maybe they didn't trust him enough to do all these things. So there was a lot of tension, a lot of friction. And ultimately, I think Schalke, which is a really tough job and a fairly neurotic club, made for a challenge that proved exhausting, in a literal sense. And it wasn't a case of him being depressed or feeling that, he wanted to walk away from football, but he was just really low on energy, having not slept enough, having probably eaten some food that he shouldn't have. I think he later explained that, he was basically eating a lot of junk food and stuff because of the stress. And I think it needed that break for him to kind of reboot and take up a new challenge, which then came when basically he wasn't just given a club, was given a whole family of football clubs to take care of and to implement a structure and a philosophy that was going to outlast him and be the basis of this tremendous success that most of the Red Bull teams have had, even though Leipzig, of course, are not officially called Red Bull.
So he's had a lot of success at, his previous clubs at Schalke, Hoffenheim, and at Red Bull. What are the ingredients that he needs to thrive in those situations?
Well, I think he needs, first of all, a degree of control. I think it's very difficult for Ralf Rangnick just to be the coach. I think he would find it very difficult for him to just be given a squad with very little input and to be told, now you coach the squad, because his whole approach is very holistic, if you will. He wants players that can fit the way he wants them to play. So the real work starts way before the squad is there. The work starts with identifying the right players, having indeed a philosophy when it comes to the transfer market. At Leipzig, it was very strong, and in Salzburg, very strongly defined, clearly defined. You wanted young players, which both had a high sell-on value, but also enough potential, as well as the ability to play that kind of demanding, very pacey, very direct, very athletic style that he favors. And it is no doubt, I think, that when you have a very clearly defined idea of what you're trying to do, but also the ability to put that idea into practice, that's when the success comes. And where he has struggled is always when he hasn't been able to do all of it. That's why I think when it comes to Milan, it is also an all or nothing approach. He cannot just be the head coach working with players that others will buy for him. He has to be in charge of the whole thing and make sure that the players and the transfer market and the tactics are all part of the same giant blueprint, as it were.
Milan, unlike Red Bull and Schalke and Hoffenheim, are a traditional powerhouse in Europe. Schalke are big, but not the size of Milan. Are his principles compatible with a big club like Milan?
I don't see why not. I think you could see through the work of Jurgen Klopp, for example, but also Nagelsmann and Rose at Gladbach, that teams are happy to be given a very strong identity. Teams and players want to know what it is this coach wants from us. And I think because his identity and his ideas are so well defined, well refined as well after, working now 40 years in this business, any club and any team, I think, can benefit from his coaching, especially if you've been given the means, both financially but also in terms of the authority, to build the squad along those lines. So, Milan are no longer the Milan of Berlusconi, where they would buy superstars and then trust a manager to do something with them, and Berlusconi interfering in the setup and in the lineup. This is now a club that's been run very differently, and I think they need that kind of strong manager and that strong figure that has his own footballing idea to impose on this Milan team. So I understand what you're saying, I understand the question, but I think this Milan now have been in the wilderness for a decade or so, and they need that kind of transformative effect that he can have. So I totally understand why the people who run the club are interested in getting a guy like him in.
He's 62 years old. He's been successful, for a while now. Why hasn't he managed or been a sporting director outside of Germany so far?
Well, I think there have been opportunities in the past. He was in the running to get the England job, for example. He turned down a number of offers from the Premier League. A couple of years ago, I think Everton came calling, but he was very happy with being the sporting director at Leipzig. I think what's happened over the last year or so is that he actually, coming back to be a coach for one more year, realized how much he enjoys it and how much he can get out of a team and out of this job if he is allowed to not just buy the players and find the right coaches and find the right setup, but actually work with players every single day. And what makes him strong and what makes him unique is also sometimes difficult as a USP, because you need to find a club that is ready to say, okay, we're going to give him basically the keys to the house. You can now for the next 2, 3, 4 years build this house, build this club from the ground up. And I think by definition, clubs who are in need of that type of management, that all encompassing coaching and management, are either in real trouble, which makes them less attractive for him, or they don't quite have the caliber and the stature that would attract him to the job. And I think Milan is a very good fit, but also a very unique club in that moment, in that situation, because they're trying to get ahead and get back to where they were. And I think they have realized and understood they need that type of, I don't want to say revolutionary, but certainly reformative and transformative figure. And you don't always get those opportunities and those setups. But this one, to me, at least on paper, sounds like an ideal one.
It sounds as if you're saying that one of the reasons that Rangnick potentially wants to leave Leipzig is because he has the itch to get back into managing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think he was very flattered to be linked with the Bayern job, and there were negotiations. Ultimately, it didn't work out. I think he was quite open to listening to Premier League clubs who were interested. There was a big meeting between him and somebody from Man United. Ultimately didn't quite evolve into something more serious, but they did sit down and talk a lot about the setup at Red Bull and possible lessons that could be learned, etc. So I think people in the business understand the value that he can bring and understand the value proposition, if you will. But it takes courage, and it takes a lot of strength to say, you know what, I'm going to give this to a guy who maybe will know better than me. And football isn't necessarily the place where people are interested in hiring people that they suspect are more qualified than them. They're quite happy to stay in their position and not have people who challenge them and who will perhaps do things a little bit differently. That's why I think for all the qualities that you bring, it's been a tough sale in a sense, because you have to get him warts and all. You have to ensure that he can do his stuff, and a lot of clubs are reluctant for a lot of reasons.
But based on the report by Bild and saying that, these are advanced talks and what you just said, can we infer that there's a good chance that he might leave in the summer?
I think it's definitely true that there is interest. I know as much myself. I know the negotiations are going on. I think there's still that battle to be won about the direction of the club. I don't know how that is panning out at this moment in time. I do know that Rangnick is open to going back into a more active role, because right now he's a slightly more administrative role, looking at sort of the intersection of the different Red Bull clubs and transfer dealings and so on, but not directly involved with the day-to-day running, and certainly not directly involved with the day-to-day coaching that he so enjoys. So if an agreement can be found, and I don't think this is going to be about money, but actually about the amount of authority and power he'll have, then there's a very strong chance that he'll take the job. But those boxes all need to be ticked, and it's quite a long list. So I think we'll have to wait a little bit longer to see if this actually works out.
Do you expect to see Rangnick at Red Bull at the beginning of next season?
I think Ralf Rangnick is eager to coach. In fact, I know as much. But he will only do it at a club where he can fulfill his ambitions of winning stuff. He doesn't want to go now and take over a club struggling against relegation in the Premier League or trying to get promoted from the Championship. He wants to win things. He wants to, I think, leave a legacy behind. I think he's at this age now where he feels about, maybe the next 5, 6, 7 years of his career being really decisive about what he can actually win. And thirdly, all the structural issues, the structural demands need to be fulfilled. And only if all those things come together, really leave. It could happen at Milan, it could happen somewhere else, but it all has to happen for him to leave. So it's quite a big ask, if you will. And we'll have to wait and see if a club comes along that's willing to tick all the boxes for him.
To find out how Rangnick would fit at AC Milan, we decided to speak with Gabriele Marcotti, a senior writer for ESPN.com. Gabriele, when we spoke 3 months ago, Stefano Pioli was just appointed AC Milan's manager. How have they done since then?
Certainly since Pioli coming in, Milan's league position, I think the general feeling around the club has improved. A lot of it has to do with the signing of Zlatan Ibrahimovic, of course, a big star, productive star. Short-term solution, and I think there's been a lift at the club, but obviously long-term questions still remain.
Does the new report about Rangnick in Bild suggest that AC Milan know that they might need a new way of doing things going forward?
I think as far as the ownership and Ivan Gazidis and the people at the top, the intention was always to do things differently than the old school way. The intention was to rely on analytics, to play a fast pressing game and so on. A lot of things that Rangnick does. Equally though, and this has been maybe some of the schizophrenia at the club, they also, need football people and are linked to the past and the traditions of the past. So they have Paolo Maldini and Zvonimir Boban and Ricky Massara in leadership positions in terms of squad building. There's a question of reconciling those two things. And by the way, Maldini and Boban, it's not like they're dinosaurs necessarily. I mean, they did come of age under Arrigo Sacchi, who was also pressing. But there's a certain belief in youth. There's a certain belief in type of playing that is obviously much stronger when it comes to Rangnick and maybe some other German managers like Marco Rose or obviously Julian Nagelsmann. And I think that appeals a lot to the club. My question would be about Rangnick is he's 62 years old. He managed last year at Leipzig, but obviously that was almost as a stopgap while they waited for Nagelsmann to come in. My question is he viable as a manager, as people who actually manage the team? Or at this stage, is he more sort of some kind of uber technical architect, director of football type thing, which is the job he has with Leipzig and Salzburg? Is that more his role right now, in which case you would still need a manager on the pitch?
So how would Rangnick change the culture at AC Milan as it is now?
I think the thinking is if you want to build a team through youth, through promising players that you can then sell at a profit and create a virtuous cycle where then bring in more talented people. There's no question about the track record at Leipzig and Salzburg. It works. This is what they do, and it's what they do very, very well. And so he would create an environment, and we've seen this at Milan, where you've got a young player and you stick with him even if he makes mistakes, and that helps him develop. You don't have this emphasis on these sort of old school values like personality and experience and quote unquote being a winner that you sometimes get with certain people. And so he would fit that. I mean, this Milan side, they're a young team. I mean, they're already at a level, and you can see this impetus has come from Gazidis and the ownership and Maldini and Boban too, where they have leaders. Donnarumma is still 20, 21 years old. Theo Hernandez, a left back, 21, 22 years old. Benacer, who's a phenomenal player, 21, 22 years old. Romagnoli's 24, 25 at center back, but a great leader and really good player. So you've got a really good core there. Raphael Leao, if you think he's ready.
So you wouldn't have to tear it all down to make this change.
No, and it would be foolish to tear it all down. But equally, I don't know that you'd want to give Rangnick, 62-year-old German dude who, frankly, walks into Milan, you'd want to give him, say, all right, you're the coach now. I think if you want to have him in the kind of role that Boban filled, but then that's a different question, though, because Boban, obviously, a very smart guy, club legend. I think that might make sense. You'd want to create a culture where you chuck people in there, people who maybe don't have any kind of experience, any kind of track record, but you see them in training, you say, you know what, this works in this. I think that would be the idea. Look, Pioli was brought in part because he has played that kind of football. He has played a high press. He does believe in kids. Rangnick would be sort of the next step up.
So this is an evolution. It's not a change of tactics.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think this is something that they toyed with in the summer. There's been all sorts of rumors about Rangnick, about Leipzig, about the Austrian corporation that makes those fizzy drinks with taurine that, while I certainly admire their football, I have a bit of an issue, especially with Leipzig, in the way they got to where they were. So, but yeah, like, there were rumors that they were going to divest themselves of their Major League Soccer franchise in New York. At that point, if you're Rangnick, all of a sudden you're just looking after two clubs. One of them, Leipzig, the club you used to coach, and with a guy, Nagelsmann, who's going to be, 31, 32, huge personality, obviously wants more control. So maybe Rangnick needs a job, and maybe Rangnick puts himself about. I personally think Milan's ideal situation would be to have perhaps leadership at the top who really buys into these values of trusting in youth and entertainment and whatever else, which I think they do to some degree, and a manager, even a no-name, who puts it into practice on the pitch. Now, Pioli's not a no-name, but he's certainly somebody who's a lot more pliable than somebody else. They've been linked with people like Adi Hütter, who, former Frankfurt guy, who plays that kind of football. But of course, you put him out there in Italy and they're like, right, who the hell is this guy? I'm sorry, who are you? We've never heard of you. Rangnick is different. Rangnick has a rep. But again, Rangnick is somebody, I go back to this, dude is 62 years old. He's one season in management. Wasn't great either at Leipzig in the one season where he was there. In recent years, has had issues in the past. So do you necessarily want to go there? I don't think it's a coincidence. People say Rangnick is the greatest genius expressed by German football, right? In coaching-wise, or one of the greatest of the last 20 years. I'm like, okay. So there's a reason he's never been to Bayern, right? Bayern who hoover up everybody. And I think part of that reason is that maybe Rangnick, who did good work at Schalke before that, maybe big clubs are wary of bringing him in.
You know, unlike Red Bull, which was a brand new club when he come and took over, and, you know, obviously not a big one, even though they had big backers financially, this is very different going to AC Milan, an old traditional sleeping giant, which I find really interesting. The two could hardly be more different. Does that fit work?
I think if it were 10 years younger, I think it might work, but I think the shakeup has already started at Milan, right, with some of the choices that they made. But the thing about Rangnick is, I don't think it's just tactics and, you know, you talk about club culture. There's a wonderful symmetry between Rangnick and the last coach to fully shake up Milan. I mean, to really shake them up. And that was Arrigo Sacchi when he came in. This guy who was unknown to most, who everybody kind of mocked and laughed at, comes in, and they're probably responsible for the last legitimate tactical revolution in football, other than Pep Guardiola. And they win 2 Champions League titles, or European Cup as it was then, back to back. They play phenomenal football. It's the 3 Dutchmen. Milan become the byword for cutting edge and innovation. And it's Sacchi who does that. It's Sacchi who's not on his own, but he is a big part of that cultural change. The difference is that when Sacchi came in, he was much younger than Rangnick is. And he wasn't dislodging 2 people, like potentially dislodging or having to work with 2 people like Boban and Maldini, who haven't been there very long, who are club legends, who are a big part of this project. I genuinely don't know that you need to go to that extreme. I think the sentiment is good. I think you're better off getting Boban and Maldini to buy into this idea a little more and to get more confident about the kids and the youth and the results. But it's tough. It's tough because if you're Milan, you continually have people sniping about, oh, Elliot have money. Why don't they spend? Well, because of financial fair play. They inherited a disastrous situation from the last 2 ownership groups. They can't spend their way. I mean, they've spent as much as they can. They can't spend their way out of it because they have to balance the books if they want to play in Europe. It's as simple as that. This belief in, Milan, and I think they also struggle with something, which is the fact that at the tail end of the Berlusconi era, Milan kind of overachieved when they won the league with Allegri and when they won the second Champions League title in 2007 by bringing in old players for often on short-term deals for a lot of money, and Ancelotti squeezing what he could. Ancelotti first, and then Allegri squeezing what he could out of them. You can't do that anymore. This is not what they're going to do, and so you have a certain nostalgia for that. That's what they're battling against. I don't think Rangnick would change that.
That leads us to our bigger idea, which is, why do you think more clubs aren't trying to hire Rangnick and kind of copy a lot of the Red Bull model?
I think there's a bit of a dirty secret to the Red Bull model, which is that it's fun to watch and it works. And then, the longer term players go out and go through, but it costs a lot of money to run. I mean, it is expensive. You need the capital. So it's not something that you're going to necessarily be able to do if you're a mid-table side. Or if you're a mid-table side, I'm talking mid-table side in the Premier League or La Liga or Serie A, if you try to go down that route and you get it wrong, you could find yourself sucked in a relegation battle very, very quickly. For a bigger side, I think what you run into is, okay, so great, Red Bull model, wow. We have the capital to do it. Let's spend it on that rather than players. But then what does it actually yield? In the sense that, Salzburg go and stomp all over the Austrian league. We know that. We see that. But that is a league where there's such an imbalance of power and their budget is 4 or 5 times everybody else's. They'd be fools not to. How's your Red Bull model working out for New York in MLS? Pulling up trees? No. What happened to that? Right? Especially now that you can have 7, 8, 9 foreign players and Red Bull with their scouting in Ghana and Brazil and all this stuff. Why is that not working? Do they not care about it? You go to Leipzig. They're my tip to win the Bundesliga this year. Now I'm getting a little bit nervous because they didn't beat Gladbach, but we can appreciate the football and whatever else. But presumably this is where, they put the majority of the resources, the majority of the attention. They have Nagelsmann, who's brilliant, whatever. Fact of the matter is, and they're still alive in the Champions League and whatever. This is the first year that it's really coming together, right? Where were they? They qualified for the Champions League last year, obviously, but they haven't challenged for the title once since coming up. They get a lot of things right. They get a lot of things wrong where they spend a lot of money. You watch Leipzig play, and blanking on his name now, but the Scottish winger, for example, that they signed.
Yeah,
Oliver something. What happened to him? Ethan Ampadu, Ademola Lookman, on the lower end, right? On the higher end, you look at this, and I think a lot of people look at this and say, okay, so Timo Werner is obviously one that worked. They spent a lot of money on him, got him from Stuttgart. But can I replicate this? Why is his football still predicated upon, it's a good example this year, right? So they're strikers. Timo Werner, everybody agrees with, no issue, right? But then they spend money on Patrick Schick, who is a guy who was at Roma, who was seen as a flop at Roma. So they're operating in a sphere where they're saying, we can't go out and sign superstars, but we're going to try to go for these value signings, try to relaunch his career, relaunching Nkunku's career. And Nkunku's doing great. Schick may or may not. But I think big clubs look at this and say, what the hell is this? I'm all for value, but I can't afford to try to relaunch people's careers. I need to go and win now. And I think that is, to some degree, that's the reluctance to go the whole hog. They would rather look at it and say, why don't I go and cherry pick some of the great players that they've produced? But then there's also another factor too, which I'm going on a bit, but this Leipzig thing really gets to me. How many Leipzig players who have moved on have lived up to the billing? Do they only work and exist in that sense, in that? I think, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but this is how big clubs think, right? They think Naby Keita, okay, so he goes to Liverpool and he sits on the bench behind freaking Jordan Henderson. All right, do I need to spend, 55, 60, 70 million on somebody like that? I think people look at that and they're like, okay, so, maybe this is great for a certain type of club, but not for us.
So the expectations at a big club like Milan, it might not make sense to go with that, value play that Red Bull are partially famous for.
Yeah. Red Bull spend a ton of money on these kids. It's not like it's a combination value play and throw a ton of money at kids, both of which come with a certain amount of risk. Now, if you're a club with no history from nowhere, you can do that and you can take a couple seasons off. Yeah, that's fine. I think it's a much tougher sell at Milan. I think what Milan are better off doing is doing what they're already kind of doing, which is spend money on kids, be aggressive about them, play the kids, but don't go out and represent yourself like you're reinventing the wheel the way Red Bull do and the way it would be all about if Rangnick were there, because frankly, you're kind of putting a target on your back when you do that.
To stay up to date on all things German football, you can read Raphael Honigstein on The Athletic and listen to him on the Steilcast podcast. Gabriele Marcotti is a senior writer for ESPN.com and the host of the Gab and Jules podcast for ESPN FC. The show is produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and this was Football Today. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on iTunes and share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.